Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Edit. Unfortunately, this is all the information I know on this story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out, and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth, and it was full of blueberry muffin mix. And it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix, and he ended up choking to death. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle. And the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs. Dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as a last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom. The giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases. Normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female. Went to medical examiner prior to donation. But they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus. Found a condom full of pills. Similar to most. The body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec. Easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. As a student in the medical field, I had the opportunity to visit a cadaver lab. I was very surprised to see how many people had died from choking. Out of the 12 or so cadavers in the lab that day, at least 7 or 8 were from choking. I went home and immediately looked up how to perform self-immolation. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon/medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or cord, of the upper chest/abdomen/pelvis. No bullet. At that point someone said, "Duck it, let's scan the whole body." Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had embolized/traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related. But before she texted back, I pulled the sheet back and already knew. He looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted, quizzed by PD about "Are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact. Fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. I was an investigator for a state medical examiner for just over 2 years. Had a mom that had drank herself to death according to the husband, after relapsing on Mother's Day weekend. I just felt like something was off. Sent her for an autopsy. Had a ruptured liver, where dude had essentially beat her till she internally bled to death. Later, while out on bail, he stole a semi-truck, crashed it in a pond, got out shooting at a deputy, and they killed him. Saved the taxpayers a good chunk of money. My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side, and died in her 60s from a heart attack. But while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer. But she never had any pain from it, because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker. So it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight, and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggled to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away, and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with crap. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life, and it didn't kill her until she was 2. I was in charge of making copies of all evidence to be used in the trial of Donald Harvey in 1989. He was known as the Angel of Death. One bit of evidence was an autopsy photo of an exhumed elderly woman. The examiner was holding with tweezers an 18-inch piece of cotton being pulled from her throat. Harvey liked to stuff cotton so far down into the victims' throats that it could not be seen. I still can't shake the image from my brain. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied, and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally, but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age, of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals he had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver, and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like, and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. I'm a med student, not a pathologist or coroner, but in anatomy lab the tank next to me had a donor with an inflatable penis pump inside his scrotum and shaft. It was completely self-contained. Fluid in the container in the scrotum could be pumped into the shaft tube, creating an erection. Then the fluid would just be released back into the pump and the boner would go away. Pretty wild. Not a doctor, but I did a necropsy on one of my birds a couple weeks ago. I couldn't tell how she died before it happened, but after opening her up I found about 14 masses of tissue in her reproductive system. At first I thought it was cancer from dissecting one of the masses. Later I found out it was actually an intestinal infection. Edit. It was actually a reproductive tract infection. Some of y'all were asking about the vulture that lives in my backyard, named Randy, so I made r/Randith the vulture. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they are made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. I'm a medical student, not a doctor, but when I dissected my cadaver in my first year, it had lots of surgical markings, and was pretty overweight. After I'd been able to work through all the parts of the body with my group, we were able to piece together with our lab leader that our donor had been in and out of the hospital for a quadruple bypass, followed by a passimica, a stomach stapling, and then what looked like an emergency open heart surgery that she died during. Not a rare disease or strange occurrence per se, but it was interesting finding clues around the body as we learned anatomy. I'm not a pathologist, but when my father died from drowning, it was noted he had acute cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner also removed a bullet from between his heart and spine that Dad received in Vietnam. It was very degraded. He had also lost a thumb and several feet of intestine there, the evidence of which was noted in the report. Dad had served 22 years in the army, and had been awarded the Purple Heart 3 times. He lived a hard life after, and it was speculated he would have passed soon of cirrhosis of the liver had he not drowned. Late to the party, but in university I applied and got into the prosection lab. Basically, we got the fresh pickled cadaver and dissected it for the anatomy lab. We weren't told anything about his medical history or cause of death. List of things we found: metal fragments in his quad and calf sternum was wired together. Old surgery. Blood jelly in the brain, old school stent above the heart. There were other weird things. Mostly though I still struggle with the smell of pepperoni, because it's so similar to embalmed corpse. Found that out after prosecuting for a few hours, and then going to the cafeteria for pepperoni pizza, and then vomiting said pepperoni pizza. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy crap. But the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the Nia Mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20 years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show. Cause the family was well known in my area. Not a doctor, but recently I was reading about Hiroshima/Nagasaki, and one person's perspective. When their family member who experienced the disaster died many years later. They were cremated, and left in their ashes were tiny pieces of broken glass and metal from the initial explosions. Edit. Article here. It requires a subscription. But you should be able to read it, because I put a after com like com. Thanks you /butter surprise. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy. Basically autopsy for animals. And one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call "hardware disease." Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-up do happen from time to time. Totally not related but somewhat related. My sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her classes involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wielded a body, and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. Not a forensic pathologist or me, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories, but the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an me who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid, and then injecting it. It reached his heart, and clogged it up. And that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. I'm not a pathologist, but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by cocaine use. The heart was apparently giant. Like having to use cocaine just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or three SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. I'm not a doctor, but my uncle, dad's only brother, died when he was 17 in a car accident. In 1975. They did an autopsy and told my grandparents he died on impact and didn't suffer. My dad personally knew the autopsy doctor, and he told him that he didn't die on impact. He suffered for a bit and had internal bleeding, and that's what ultimately caused his death. My dad hasn't and will never tell his parents. Bad accident during high school, missing scalp of young girl, coroner couldn't find it. My buddy worked at impound yard and found it embedded in broken windshield frame/glass. Pretty gruesome. Disclaimer: not a pathologist. In anatomy lab in medical school, we found one of the cadavers had a penis pump. There's a pump you squeeze in the scrotum that pushes water, stored up in a hard plastic water balloon in the abdominal cavity, into a tube in the penis. Other story I've told before. But I was dissecting the back of a knee when the knee implant that I didn't know was there popped out. For a brief, stupid moment I thought it was a Terminator and screeched.